Hi guys, sorry to interrupt your viewing, but please subscribe to the channel and like this video. Thank you.
When I needed my parents the most, facing surgery and mounting medical bills, they told me they just couldn't afford to help. But weeks later, they threw my brother a lavish wedding, his third one. That was the moment I realized just how deep their favoritism ran, and it changed everything about how I saw my family. It all began about 2 years ago, during one of the most stressful periods of my life. For months, I'd been battling intense abdominal pain that would come and go, leaving me doubled over and unable to function at times. At first, I chalked it up to stress or maybe something I ate, but as the episodes became more frequent and severe, I knew I couldn't ignore it any longer. After weeks of bouncing between doctors, undergoing tests, and anxiously waiting for results, I finally had an answer. I needed surgery. It wasn't life-threatening, but it was urgent. The doctors explained that if I didn't address the issue soon, it could escalate into something much worse. Hearing the diagnosis brought a strange mix of relief and dread. Relief because I finally knew what was wrong and how to fix it, but dread because I had no idea how I was going to afford it. At the time, I was working a steady job that paid decently, but my insurance left much to be desired. It didn't cover everything, and between the deductibles, copays, and the weeks I'd need off work to recover, the costs were stacking up fast. I did the math over and over, hoping I'd made a mistake, but the numbers didn't lie. I was looking at thousands of dollars in expenses that I simply didn't have. I've always prided myself on being independent, the type of person who doesn't like to ask for help. But this wasn't something I could handle alone. Reluctantly, I decided to turn to my parents. They weren't rich, but they were comfortable, and they'd always preached the importance of families sticking together. Surely, they want to help me in my time of need. When I called them that evening, my mom answered, her voice warm and cheerful as usual. "Hi, honey. How are you?" I hesitated, unsure how to bring it up, but finally blurted, "I need to talk to you and Dad about something important." As I explained the situation, my diagnosis, the surgery, the mounting expenses, I expected them to express concern or at least offer some words of comfort. Instead, what I got was hesitation. "Oh," my mom said after a long pause. "That's a lot." "It is," I agreed, my voice faltering. "I hate to ask, but I was wondering if you could help me out, even just with a loan. I'll pay you back, I promise." "Well," she trailed off, and I could hear my dad murmuring something in the background. "Let me put you on speaker," she said, and a moment later, my dad's voice came through. "We'd love to help, but things are tight right now," he said, his tone matter-of-fact. "Tight?" I repeated, stunned. "I'm not asking for a handout. I just need a little help to get through this. It's surgery, Dad. I don't have a choice." He sighed heavily, the kind of sigh that always made me feel like I was being a burden. "We understand, but we got a lot on our plate too. You'll have to figure something else out." I sat there, clutching the phone, trying to process what I was hearing. "You can't help at all?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "It's not that we don't want to," my mom added quickly, as if that softened the blow. "It's just not a good time for us financially." I didn't know what to say. This was my parents, the people who'd always said, family comes first, the people I thought I could count on. After a long, awkward silence, my dad spoke again. "You're resourceful. You'll figure it out." The words felt like a slap. I muttered a quick goodbye and hung up, tears stinging my eyes. That night, as I sat on the edge of my bed staring at the stack of medical bills, I felt an overwhelming mix of emotions: anger, hurt, and a deep sense of betrayal. I couldn't understand how they could turn their backs on me like that, especially when they'd always been so quick to help my brother Mark with his endless string of crises. But there was no time to dwell on it. I had to find a way to cover the costs. Taking out a personal loan with a sky-high interest rate was my only option, and I reluctantly signed the paperwork, knowing it would take me years to pay it off. As I prepared for the surgery and the challenges ahead, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just about money. It was about what their refusal said about how they saw me, and what I meant to them. Little did I know, this was only the beginning of the cracks that would shatter my view of my family. The rejection from my parents hit me harder than I expected. After explaining my situation in detail, my diagnosis, the urgency of the surgery, and the staggering costs, I thought they'd at least offer some words of encouragement, if not immediate help. Instead, I was met with hesitation. "We'd love to help, honey," my mom said, her voice uncertain, "but we're not in a position to do that right now." I blinked, gripping the phone tighter. "Not in a position?" I repeated. "It's not like I'm asking for a handout. I just need a loan. I'll pay you back." My dad, who had been quiet up until that point, finally spoke up. "We just can't afford to do that," he said, his tone matter-of-fact. You'll have to figure something else out. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. You can't afford it? I asked, incredulous. You've helped Mark so many times. How is this different? That's not fair, my mom replied quickly, her voice defensive. Mark's situations were unique. Unique? I shot back. Like the time you paid off his credit card debt because he forgot to pay it? Or the time you co-signed on his car loan after he totaled the first one? That's enough, my dad said sharply, cutting me off. We've done a lot for you too. Don't act like we haven't. I wanted to ask, like what? But the words got caught in my throat. I knew arguing wouldn't change anything. Instead, I ended the call as quickly as I could, muttering a strained, thanks anyway, before hanging up. Over the next few days, I scrambled to figure out how I was going to cover the costs on my own. The surgery couldn't wait, and neither could the mounting bills. After hours of research and phone calls, I secured a personal loan with a painfully high interest rate. It wasn't ideal, but it was my only option. The financial stress was crushing. On top of worrying about the surgery itself, I now had to contend with the reality of years of debt. I picked up extra shifts at work, even though I knew I'd have to take time off to recover. Every dollar I earned felt like a drop in the ocean compared to what I owed. Meanwhile, my parents acted like nothing had happened. They didn't ask how I was doing or offer to check in during my recovery. When I called to update them on the surgery date, they were polite but distant, changing the subject quickly to lighter topics like the weather or a TV show they'd started watching. The indifference stung more than I wanted to admit. It wasn't just about the money. It was about feeling like my pain and struggles didn't matter to them. This was the couple who had always preached about the importance of family, who had stepped in time and time again to bail out my brother Mark. Yet when it was my turn to ask for help, they turned me away without a second thought. I tried to rationalize their behavior, telling myself that maybe they really couldn't afford it. But deep down, I didn't believe that. My parents weren't wealthy, but they weren't struggling either. They'd always managed to come through for Mark, no matter how unique his situations were. The more I thought about it, the angrier I became, not just at them, but at myself for expecting anything different. Their favoritism toward Mark had always been obvious, but I'd ignored it, convincing myself that it didn't mean they cared about me any less. Now it was impossible to ignore. That realization left a bitter taste in my mouth, but I didn't have time to dwell on it. I had surgery to prepare for, bills to pay, and a recovery to face alone. A few weeks after my surgery, I was still in the thick of recovery. My body ached, the medical bills kept piling up, and I was working as many extra shifts as I could manage to stay afloat. It wasn't just the physical toll. I was emotionally drained, feeling alone in a way I hadn't expected. My parents hadn't called to check on me once, and I was starting to accept that I couldn't count on them for support. So, when my mom's name lit up my phone one evening, I hesitated before answering. "Hi, Mom," I said, trying to keep my voice upbeat despite my exhaustion. "Hi, sweetheart," she replied, her tone so cheerful it was almost jarring. "Guess what? Mark's getting married again." I felt a twinge of irritation but quickly masked it. "That's great," I said, forcing enthusiasm into my voice. "When's the wedding?" "Oh, it's going to be in 3 months," she said, her excitement bubbling over. "He and Lisa have already started planning. It's going to be a beautiful event, outdoor venue, live band, the whole 9 yards. We're so happy for them." I nodded absent-mindedly, though she couldn't see me. "Sounds nice," I said, unsure where this was going. "And we're helping with the costs," she continued, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "It's his 3rd time, but we want to make it special for him. He's finally found the one." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. "You're paying for Mark's wedding?" I asked, unable to keep the sharpness out of my tone. "Yes, of course," she said, sounding slightly taken aback by my reaction. "He's been through so much, and he deserves this." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. They couldn't afford to help me with surgery, something I literally needed to survive, but they had no problem throwing thousands of dollars at a wedding, his 3rd wedding no less. "Wow," I said, my voice tight. "That's generous of you." "Well, it's family," she said, her tone suddenly a bit defensive, as if she'd sensed the shift in my mood. "We want to support him however we can. You know how important this is for Mark." I didn't respond right away. A part of me wanted to scream, to remind her that I'd begged for their help just weeks earlier and been brushed aside. But I bit my tongue, unwilling to start a fight while I was still recovering. "Well," I said finally, "I hope it's everything he wants it to be." "Oh, it will be," she said, oblivious to my strained tone. "Lisa's got such great taste, and they're sparing no expense. It's going to be the event of the year." I hung up shortly after, making an excuse about needing to rest. As I set my phone down, I stared at the ceiling, my mind racing. It wasn't just the money, It was the blatant favoritism, the way my parents always bent over backward for Mark while treating me like an afterthought. The more I thought about it, the angrier I became. They had chosen to prioritize a lavish wedding over my health, and no matter how much I tried to rationalize their decision, I couldn't make sense of it. I realized then that this wasn't just about the surgery or the wedding. It was about a lifetime of feeling like I was always second place, like my needs and achievements would never matter as much as Mark's failures. And for the first time, I wasn't sure if I could let it slide. The frustration I'd been bottling up since my mom's call finally reached a boiling point. I couldn't let it fester any longer. The next time I visited my parents, I knew I had to say something. I didn't plan a speech or rehearse my words. I just walked in, tense and determined to get answers. We were sitting in the living room, my mom chatting about Mark's wedding plans while my dad scrolled on his phone. I waited for a pause in the conversation before speaking. "How can you afford to pay for Mark's wedding, but not help me with my surgery?" I asked, my voice trembling with barely contained anger. The room fell silent. My mom's face flushed, and she looked uncomfortable, fidgeting with the edge of her sweater. My dad set his phone down and frowned, his expression unreadable. "That's different," he said finally, his tone calm but dismissive. "A wedding is a celebration. Surgery, well, that's just life. Just life." I repeated, incredulous. "Do you even hear yourselves? I was in pain, terrified, and drowning in bills, and you told me you couldn't afford to help. But now you're throwing thousands at a party for Mark?" "It's not a party," my mom interjected defensively. "It's a new beginning for him. He's been through so much, and we want to support him." "Been through so much?" I snapped, my voice rising. "Mark has been the golden child his whole life. You've bailed him out of every mistake he's ever made. Meanwhile, I've had to fend for myself every single time I needed help." My dad stiffened, his frown deepening. "That's not fair," he said, his voice growing stern. "We helped you plenty of times." "Name one," I shot back, my frustration boiling over. "Name one time you've stepped in for me the way you've stepped in for Mark." Neither of them answered. My mom looked at my dad as if hoping he'd have an explanation, but he stayed silent. "That's what I thought," I said bitterly. "You've always prioritized Mark, no matter what. He screws up, and you rush to fix it. I do everything I can to stay afloat on my own, and when I finally ask for help, you tell me to figure it out. How is that fair?" "It's not about fairness," my dad said, his tone exasperated. "Mark needed our help. His divorce was messy, and he's trying to rebuild his life. You've always been independent. You don't need us the same way he does." I stared at him, stunned. "Do you even realize how insulting that is? You're punishing me for being responsible for not needing you as much. Do you know how hard it was for me to ask for help with my surgery? And you just turned me away." My mom opened her mouth to speak, but I wasn't done. "And now you're telling me it's more important to throw Mark a lavish wedding, his third wedding, than to help your own daughter with medical bills? Do you have any idea how that feels?" My mom's voice trembled as she replied, "It's not that we don't care about you. We have to make tough choices sometimes." "Tough choices?" I repeated, incredulous. "This isn't tough. It's favoritism, plain and simple. And I'm tired of pretending it doesn't exist." The tension in the room was suffocating. My dad sighed heavily, rubbing his temples. "You're making this into a bigger deal than it needs to be," he said. "Mark's wedding is important to us. That doesn't mean we don't care about you." "It sure feels like it," I said quietly, my voice thick with emotion. "I needed you, and you weren't there. And now you're expecting me to smile and play along like nothing's wrong." My mom's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't say anything. My dad just looked away, avoiding my gaze. I stood up, my chest tight with frustration and sadness. "I'm done," I said, my voice shaking. "You've made it clear where I stand in this family." I walked out before they could respond, my heart pounding as I got into my car. As I drove home, I felt a mix of anger, betrayal, and a deep sadness that I couldn't shake. This wasn't just about the surgery or the wedding. It was about years of being treated like I mattered less, of always being the afterthought in a family that was supposed to have my back. And for the first time, I started to wonder if things would ever change. After that explosive confrontation, the dynamic between me and my parents shifted completely. Every interaction, whether on the phone or in person, was laced with an unspoken tension that neither of us wanted to address. It felt like there was a wall between us now, one that had been slowly building for years, but had finally solidified. Conversations became shorter, more superficial. My mom would ask how work was going, or if I'd seen the latest episode of some show she loved, carefully avoiding any mention of the confrontation or the surgery. My dad was even more distant, his tone clipped and formal whenever we spoke. At first, I made an effort to bridge the gap, hoping they'd realize how hurt I was and reach out. But as weeks turned into months, it became clear that they weren't going to acknowledge the rift or their role in creating it. Meanwhile, Mark's wedding planning consumed every family conversation. My mom called frequently to gush about the venue, the floral arrangements, the catering menu, and Lisa's stunning dress. It was as if nothing else mattered, as if the wedding were the most important event in the world. Every detail felt like a slap in the face. I couldn't help but think about the money they were pouring into this one-day celebration while I was still drowning in medical debt. They never once asked how I was doing or if I needed anything, even though they knew I was struggling to recover financially. One particularly painful moment came when my mom casually mentioned that they'd hired a professional photographer and videographer for the wedding. "It's going to be so beautiful," she said, her voice brimming with excitement. "Mark and Lisa will have memories to last a lifetime." I bit my tongue, swallowing the urge to say I'd settle for just having my medical bills paid off. Instead, I murmured something non-committal and ended the call as quickly as I could. The emotional toll was too much to bear. I began pulling away, not out of spite, but out of self-preservation. Visiting them felt like subjecting myself to a constant reminder of how little I mattered in comparison to Mark. Every time I heard them talk about the wedding, it was like pouring salt on a wound that hadn't even begun to heal. At first, they didn't seem to notice. My absences were brushed off as me being busy with work, and my dad even commented once that he was proud of how independent I was. The irony of that statement wasn't lost on me. But as my visits grew less frequent and my calls more sporadic, the questions began. "Why don't you come around more often?" my mom asked during one call, her voice tinged with confusion. "I've just been busy," I replied, keeping my tone neutral. "Well, you should make time," she said, a hint of irritation creeping in. "Family is important." The hypocrisy of her words nearly made me laugh. Instead, I changed the subject, unwilling to get into another argument. Deep down, I knew this wasn't sustainable. The distance I'd created was a temporary solution, a way to protect myself from the constant sting of their favoritism. But it didn't fix the underlying problem, the years of hurt, the glaring inequity between how they treated me and how they treated Mark. I wanted to believe that they'd eventually see how their actions had affected me, that they'd reach out and try to make things right. But the longer the silence stretched, the more I realized that might never happen. For the first time, I began to wonder if I could truly heal while still holding on to the hope that things would change. And if they didn't, if my parents continued to prioritize Mark at my expense, what would that mean for our relationship moving forward? The answers weren't clear, but one thing was certain. I couldn't keep pretending everything was fine when it so clearly wasn't. As I pulled further away from my parents, something I'd always suspected but never fully acknowledged became glaringly clear. They had always favored Mark. It wasn't just about the wedding or the surgery. Those were only the latest examples in a long pattern of behavior that had defined our family dynamic for as long as I could remember. I started looking back on my childhood, replaying memories with a new perspective. Mark had always been the golden child, the one who could do no wrong. When he struggled in school, my parents hired tutors and sat through parent-teacher conferences to ensure he had every opportunity to succeed. When I excelled academically, they offered polite congratulations but didn't make a big deal about it. As adults, the disparity became even more obvious. When Mark got married the first time, they paid for most of the wedding. After his divorce, they helped him get back on his feet, covering legal fees and even giving him money to furnish a new apartment. When he remarried, they paid for that wedding too. And now, with his third wedding on the horizon, they were going all out once again. Meanwhile, I had always been the independent one. My parents prided themselves on how self-sufficient I was, often telling friends and relatives how they never had to worry about me. And while part of me was proud of my independence, another part resented the way they used it as an excuse to prioritize Mark's needs over mine. The surgery was just the latest and most painful reminder of how little they seemed to value me in comparison. When I'd ask for help, they'd brush me off, claiming they couldn't afford it. Yet they had no problem throwing thousands of dollars at Mark's wedding, a celebration for a relationship that might not even last if history was any indication. The realization was like a punch to the gut. I'd spent so much of my life trying to prove myself to my parents, hoping they'd finally see me as someone worth investing in. But the truth was their favoritism wasn't about me not being good enough. It was about their choice to prioritize Mark, no matter the cost. As painful as that realization was, it was also freeing in a strange way. For the first time, I stopped blaming myself for the way things were. I'd spent years wondering if I wasn't smart enough, successful enough, or lovable enough to earn their attention and support. But it wasn't about me. It was about them. I began to let go of the need for their validation. It wasn't easy. It felt like unlearning something I'd been taught my whole life. But with each passing day, I grew more confident in the idea that my worth wasn't tied to their approval. That shift in perspective didn't erase the hurt, but it helped me set boundaries. I stopped answering their calls as frequently and declined invitations to family events that felt more like obligations than genuine opportunities to connect. When they asked why I wasn't around as much, I told them the truth. I need space to focus on myself. Mark, of course, remained oblivious to the tension. Whenever we did see each other, he'd talk about his wedding plans with the same enthusiasm as my parents, completely unaware or uninterested in how it might affect me. Part of me wanted to confront him, to tell him how much his constant need for support had cost me emotionally. But I knew it wouldn't make a difference. Mark wasn't the problem. He was just the symptom of a deeper issue within our family. As I watched my parents pour their time, energy, and money into Mark's wedding, I realized I didn't want to compete for their attention anymore. I didn't want to be the daughter who quietly resented her brother or the one who measured her worth by how much her parents were willing to do for her. I wanted to be free from the favoritism, from the constant comparison, and from the idea that I had to earn my place in my own family. And for the first time, I felt like I was getting there. The road ahead wasn't easy, but I knew one thing for certain. I deserved better. Mark's wedding day arrived sooner than I expected. In the weeks leading up to it, I debated whether or not to attend. A big part of me didn't want to go. I didn't want to watch my parents shower Mark with attention and resources while pretending everything was fine between us. But another part of me knew that skipping the wedding would only give them more ammunition to paint me as the bitter, ungrateful sibling. So I went. I put on my best dress, plastered a polite smile on my face, and walked into the venue determined to get through the day without causing a scene. The ceremony was beautiful, as weddings tend to be, but I couldn't help noticing the little details that screamed extravagance. The designer flowers, the live string quartet, the open bar stocked with top-shelf liquor. Every detail was a reminder of how much my parents had invested in Mark's third wedding while I was still struggling to recover from the financial blow of my surgery. But I kept my composure, determined not to let my feelings show. The reception, however, was a different story. The lavishness of it all was overwhelming. A 5-course meal, a custom ice sculpture, and a band that probably cost more than my rent. I felt like an outsider the entire night, sitting at my assigned table and making polite conversation with distant relatives who barely knew me. At one point during the reception, my mom pulled me aside, her face glowing with pride. "Isn't this beautiful?" she asked, gesturing to the bustling room. "We're so proud of Mark. He's finally getting his happy ending." Something inside me snapped. I couldn't hold back anymore. "Proud of what, exactly?" I asked, my voice steady but laced with anger. "That he's getting married for the 3rd time, while I'm still paying off surgery bills because you couldn't afford to help me?" The smile faded from her face, replaced by a look of shock and discomfort. "That's not fair," she said after a moment, her voice defensive. "We've done a lot for you two." "Like what?" I shot back, my voice rising. "Name one time you've helped me the way you've helped Mark." "Just one." She opened her mouth to respond but hesitated, as if searching for an example. The silence between us stretched uncomfortably, and I could see the guilt flickering across her face. Finally, she said weakly, "You've always been so independent. We thought you didn't need us the same way Mark does." I let out a bitter laugh. "That's not an answer, Mom. That's an excuse. Do you even realize how insulting it is to punish me for being self-sufficient while rewarding Mark for needing constant help? You've always put him first, no matter what it costs me." Her face reddened, and I could see tears welling up in her eyes. "That's not true," she said, though her voice lacked conviction. "It is true," I said, my voice trembling with emotion. "When I needed you, when I was scared and couldn't afford surgery, you told me to figure it out on my own. And now you're standing here, proud of the fact that you've spent thousands on Mark's 3rd wedding. How can you not see how unfair that is?" She didn't respond. Instead, she looked away, her expression a mixture of shame and frustration. For a moment, I thought she might apologize, but then my dad approached, clearly sensing the tension. "What's going on?" he asked, his tone wary. "Nothing," my mom said quickly, brushing past him. "We should get back to the reception." I watched her walk away, my chest tight with a mix of anger and sadness. My dad gave me a questioning look, but I didn't have the energy to explain. "It's fine," I muttered, heading back to my table. For the rest of the night, I felt like I was moving through a haze. I avoided my parents as much as possible, focusing instead on making it through the reception without breaking down. When the party finally ended and I returned home, I sat in my car for a long time, replaying the confrontation in my mind. I'd finally said what I'd been holding in for so long, but it didn't feel like a victory. My mom's reaction, the guilt, the avoidance, the refusal to truly acknowledge my feelings, only confirmed what I'd suspected all along. My parents weren't going to change. This wasn't the resolution I'd hoped for, but it was a turning point. For the first time, I stopped waiting for them to validate my feelings or prioritize me the way they prioritized Mark. If they couldn't see the harm they caused, that was on them, not me. And while it hurt to accept, I knew I had to let go of the hope that things would ever be different. After Mark's wedding, I made a conscious decision to step back from my family. The emotional toll of their favoritism had become too much to bear, and every interaction with them felt like reopening a wound that refused to heal. I realized that trying to maintain the facade of a normal relationship was doing more harm than good. At first, it felt strange to distance myself from people who were supposed to be my biggest supporters. My parents had always been such a central part of my life, even if that connection was flawed. But the more I thought about it, the more I understood that stepping back wasn't about punishing them. It was about protecting myself. The silence between us stretched into weeks, then months. My parents called occasionally, but I let most of the calls go to voicemail. When I did pick up, the conversations were polite but shallow, avoiding any mention of the wedding or the confrontation at the reception. It felt like we were strangers going through the motions of pretending to care. During this time, I threw myself into building a life that felt meaningful and fulfilling. I leaned on my friends, who had always been a source of unwavering support. Unlike my parents, they didn't see me as independent to the point of being invulnerable. They acknowledged my struggles, offered help when I needed it, and celebrated my victories without hesitation. I also started therapy, something I'd been hesitant to do for years. My therapist helped me unpack the resentment I'd been carrying, guiding me to see that my anger wasn't something to be ashamed of. It was a natural response to feeling overlooked and undervalued. "You've been holding on to the hope that they'll change," my therapist said during one session. "But that hope is only hurting you. Letting go doesn't mean giving up on them. It means freeing yourself from the expectation that they'll be the people you need them to be." Her words hit me hard, but they also brought a sense of clarity. I realized that I'd spent years trying to earn my parents' approval, believing that if I worked hard enough or proved myself enough, they'd finally see me as their equal. But that wasn't going to happen, and continuing to chase that validation was only prolonging my pain. The distance gave me space to reflect and heal. I started finding joy in small things again, spending lazy Sundays with friends, exploring new hobbies, and taking pride in the progress I was making at work. I even paid off a significant chunk of my medical debt, a milestone that felt like reclaiming control over my life. Slowly but surely, I began to let go of the anger that had consumed me for so long. It wasn't easy. There were days when the resentment bubbled back to the surface, especially when I saw social media posts from Mark or heard updates about my parents' latest efforts to support him. But those moments became less frequent as I focused on the people and experiences that truly mattered. I also started to redefine my idea of family. For so long, I'd clung to the belief that blood ties were sacred, that my parents' approval was essential to my happiness. But I realized that family isn't just about shared DNA. It's about the people who show up for you, who respect you, and who love you without conditions. As time passed, I began to feel lighter, freer. The distance from my parents wasn't just physical, it was emotional too. I no longer felt the constant ache of wanting something from them that they couldn't give. That clarity didn't erase the hurt, but it helped me put things into perspective. My parents weren't going to change, and expecting them to was only hurting me. Letting go of that expectation was one of the hardest things I'd ever done, but it was also one of the most liberating. By focusing on my own well-being and surrounding myself with people who valued me for who I was, I found a sense of peace that had eluded me for years. And for the first time, I felt like I was truly living for myself, not for anyone else's approval. As time passed, I found myself looking back on the situation with clearer eyes. The pain of my parents' favoritism still lingered. It wasn't something I could forget or brush aside entirely, but I began to understand it differently. It wasn't a reflection of my value or who I was as a person. It was about them, their choices, and their priorities. For so long, I had carried the weight of their decisions, questioning whether I was somehow to blame. Was I not good enough? Not successful enough? Not lovable enough? But the more I reflected, the more I realized that their favoritism had nothing to do with me and everything to do with how they chose to navigate their relationships. This shift in perspective wasn't immediate or easy. It came gradually through countless moments of introspection, conversations with friends, and breakthroughs in therapy. My therapist once said something that stayed with me. You can't control how people treat you, but you can control how you let it affect you. Slowly, I began to let go of the need for their validation. One of the biggest turning points was recognizing that I didn't need to compete with Mark. For years, I'd compared myself to him, measuring my achievements against his failures and wondering why my hard work seemed to go unnoticed while his mistakes were met with unwavering support. But as I stepped back, I saw how exhausting and pointless that competition had been. I wasn't in a race with Mark, and trying to outshine him wouldn't change the way my parents treated us. Accepting that was both painful and freeing. Instead of trying to prove myself to my parents, I began focusing on building a life that felt meaningful to me. I threw myself into my work, not to earn their approval, but because I genuinely enjoyed what I was doing. I pursued hobbies that brought me joy, spent more time with friends who uplifted me, and started setting goals that aligned with my values rather than someone else's expectations. It was a subtle but profound shift. For the first time, I was living for myself, not for the hope that someone else might finally recognize my worth. This new mindset didn't erase the hurt entirely, but it gave me a sense of peace. I no longer felt the constant ache of wanting something from my parents that they couldn't, or wouldn't give. Their choices still stung, but I stopped letting them dictate how I saw myself. I also stopped feeling guilty for stepping back from our relationship. For years, I'd been afraid that distancing myself would make me a bad daughter, that I was somehow failing in my role by not trying harder to fix things. But I realized that protecting my own well-being wasn't selfish, it was necessary. By focusing on what truly mattered to me, I began to see my parents' actions in a different light. Their favoritism said more about their own limitations and biases than it did about me. They had their reasons, flawed and unfair as they were, and those reasons didn't diminish my value as a person. The clarity I gained through reflection wasn't just about my relationship with my parents. It extended to how I approach life in general. I stopped seeking approval from people who couldn't or wouldn't give it and started surrounding myself with people who appreciated me for who I was. Through this process, I came to understand something important. Worth isn't something that comes from others. It's something you define for yourself. And while I still wish my parents could see me the way I wanted them to, I no longer needed them to. This shift didn't mean I forgave them completely or that the pain magically disappeared. But it allowed me to move forward without carrying the weight of their choices on my shoulders. For the first time, I felt free to live my life on my own terms, unburdened by the expectations and disappointments of the past. And in that freedom, I found a sense of fulfillment that I hadn't realized I was missing. Years have passed since the tumultuous days of my surgery, Mark's wedding, and the confrontation that changed the way I saw my family. Looking back, I can see how those moments were a turning point, not just in my relationship with my parents, but in how I chose to live my life. Today, my relationship with my parents is surface level at best. We talk occasionally, exchanging pleasantries about work or the weather, but the deep connection I once hoped for isn't there. And for the first time, I'm okay with that. I've stopped trying to force something that doesn't come naturally, and I've let go of the idea that they'll ever treat me the way I once wanted them to. The distance between us isn't out of anger or resentment anymore. It's simply a boundary I've set to protect my peace. They are who they are, and I've learned to accept that without letting it define me. As for Mark, we rarely speak. Our lives have taken such different paths that it feels natural to drift apart. I don't hold a grudge against him anymore. He's just living the life he knows, and I've realized it's not my job to resent him for the choices my parents made. In some ways, I even feel sorry for him. Mark's reliance on my parents, his need for their constant validation, and their willingness to enable him have created a cycle that he may never break free from. I, on the other hand, have built a life of my own, one that doesn't rely on anyone else's approval to feel complete. Letting go of the resentment I carried toward Mark wasn't easy, but it was necessary. Holding on to that anger only kept me tethered to a past I wanted to move on from. By releasing it, I found a sense of freedom and clarity that allowed me to focus on what truly mattered. Today, my life is filled with people who love and support me for who I am. My friends have become my chosen family, standing by me through thick and thin. Their encouragement and kindness have reminded me that true relationships are built on mutual respect and understanding, not obligation or favoritism. I've also made strides in my career, pursuing opportunities that align with my passions and values. The satisfaction I feel from achieving my goals on my own terms is something I wouldn't trade for anything. Most importantly, I've learned to prioritize my own well-being. Whether it's through therapy, self-care, or simply surrounding myself with positivity, I've found ways to nurture my mental and emotional health. The anger and sadness that once consumed me have given way to a sense of peace I never thought I'd find. Looking back, I know my mom, the version of her I hold in my heart, would be proud of how far I've come. Not because of what I've endured, but because of how I've chosen to rise above it. The pain of the past will always be a part of my story, but it no longer defines me. Instead, it's a reminder of my resilience, my strength, and my ability to create a life that feels whole and meaningful. I've learned that letting go doesn't mean forgetting or excusing what happened. It means choosing not to let it control you anymore. And in that choice, I've found a sense of peace that's truly my own.